I've worked in hospitals for nearly 2 decades now, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that I've seen things that would shake most people's understanding of what's possible. I've witnessed recoveries that defied every medical prediction, and I've watched young lives slip away despite our most aggressive interventions. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I witnessed in room 347 of the San Gerardo Hospital in Monza during those 3 October days in 2006. My name is Alessandra Moretti, and I'm a nursing technician specializing in hematology and oncology. It's not an easy field, and I won't pretend otherwise. You develop a necessary armor against the constant presence of suffering and death. You learn to see patients as cases, conditions, treatment protocols. You have to, or the weight of it all would crush you within a year. The San Gerardo Hospital in Monza is one of the premier medical facilities in Lombardy, renowned for its oncology and hematology departments. The hematology ward where I worked was on the 4th floor, bright, clean, equipped with the latest technology, and filled with some of the most devastating cases you could imagine. I was 32 years old in October 2006, and I'd been working at San Gerardo for 8 years. 8 years of early mornings and late nights, of perfecting the art of finding veins in patients brutalized by chemotherapy. I knew every corridor, every quirk of our ward. I was good at my job, efficient, knowledgeable, compassionate when needed, but never emotionally entangled. I'd seen teenagers with leukemia before, too many of them. Julia, 14, who relapsed a 3rd time. Marco, 17, preparing for university when diagnosed. Francesca, 13, who drew pictures for the nursing staff. Some made it, some didn't. That was the brutal reality of pediatric oncology. You either compartmentalized or burned out within 2 years. I grew up Catholic, like most Italians of my generation. Baptized, First Communion, Confirmation. My grandmother, Nonna Maria, had been devout, her fingers constantly working through worn rosary beads. A crucifix above every doorway. Prayers before meals. After she died when I was 23, whatever fragile connection I'd maintained to faith slipped away with her. I went to Mass maybe twice a year, more out of obligation than genuine faith. God felt distant, theoretical, irrelevant to the concrete realities of blood counts and dying children. If there was a benevolent, divine being watching over us, he seemed remarkably absent from the pediatric oncology ward. The night shift on Monday, October 9th, 2006, started like any other. I arrived at San Gerardo at 7 in the evening, changed into my scrubs, and checked the patient roster. We had a new admission in room 347, a 15-year-old boy transferred from the Damaci Clinic in Milan. The notes were concerning: acute promyelocytic leukemia, M3 classification, critical condition, initially misdiagnosed as influenza. Condition deteriorated rapidly. The M3 classification was one of the most aggressive subtypes, immature white blood cells crowding out healthy ones, with catastrophic bleeding and clotting risks. The survival statistics weren't encouraging. His name was Carlo Acutis, 15 years old, perfectly healthy until 10 days earlier. By the time they figured out what was happening, the disease had gained significant ground. When I first entered room 347 that evening, I expected fear, anger, or despair, the usual responses of critically ill teenagers. Instead, I found something I'd never encountered before. Carlo was sitting up in bed, looking remarkably composed. He was pale, with that grayish pallor of severe anemia. Bruises were forming on his arms from blood draws, and IVS the easy bruising characteristic of his leukemia. But his eyes were clear, calm, peaceful. His mother, Antonia, sat beside his bed, elegant but drawn with worry, maintaining the dignified composure I recognized from other Italian mothers determined not to fall apart in front of her child. His father, Andrea, stood by the window, tension visible in his rigid shoulders and clenched jaw, father unable to protect his child. There was grief and fear in that room, but also something else. A different quality of atmosphere I couldn't identify. "Good evening," I said. "I'm Alessandra Moretti. I'll be taking care of Carlo during night shifts." Carlo turned and smiled a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you for taking care of me," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I know you do very difficult work." "I'm grateful." I was taken aback. Most 15-year-olds didn't thank their nurses before anything had even been done, especially not when facing life-threatening illness. "It's my job," I said, trying to maintain professional distance. "How are you feeling? Any pain?" "A little tired," he admitted. "My bones ache, but I'm okay. I'm in God's hands." That phrase I'd heard countless times, usually with desperate hope or fatalism. But Carlo said it differently, a simple fact with complete trust. I checked his vitals, noting them in his chart with practiced efficiency. His blood pressure was lower than ideal 90/60ths, reflecting his anemia and the strain on his cardiovascular system. His heart rate was elevated at 110 beats per minute. His body compensating desperately for the lack of oxygen-carrying red blood cells. His temperature was 38.5 Celsius, not quite a fever, but elevated enough to be concerning, suggesting possible infection or the inflammatory response of his disease. I adjusted his foreline, which was delivering fluids and medication at a carefully calculated rate, and made detailed notes about his condition. The medical picture was grim, painted in numbers that told a story of a body under siege. His white blood cell count was dangerously abnormal, with immature promyelocytes crowding out healthy cells in his bone marrow and bloodstream. His platelet count was critically low at 15,000. Normal is 150,000 too, 400,000 which meant he was at extreme risk for spontaneous bleeding, both internal and external. His hemoglobin was down to 7 grams per deciliter, explaining his profound fatigue and that terrible pallor that made him look almost ghostly. He would need aggressive treatment, chemotherapy, blood transfusions, platelet infusions, and careful monitoring for complications. Fun, then encouraging. Acute promyelocytic leukemia could be treated successfully if caught early. But Carlo's rapid progression suggested a particularly aggressive case. As I worked, making notes and checking equipment to ensure everything was functioning properly, I noticed something on his bedside table that seemed completely out of place in the sterile, clinical hospital environment. A rosary. It wasn't one of those cheap, mass-produced plastic ones you sometimes find in hospital gift shops or tourist stands outside churches, and pilgrimage sites gaudy things with garish colors and lightweight beads that feel more like toys than devotional objects. This one looked well used, almost like an antique. The beads were wooden, dark with age and handling, each one worn smooth from what must have been years of prayer. The crucifix was simple metal, tarnished slightly, with a small corpus of Christ that had been handled so often the details had softened. The connecting chain had a faint discoloration that suggested constant contact with skin oils and sweat. It was clear this wasn't a recent acquisition brought in as a desperate talisman against illness. This was something Carlo had been using regularly, probably daily, for a very long time. "That's a beautiful rosary," I commented, more out of professional courtesy than genuine interest. I'd learned to notice what was important to patients, to make small talk about their personal items as a way of establishing rapport and maintaining their dignity in the depersonalizing environment of hospitalization. Carlo's face lit up with an enthusiasm that seemed surprising given his condition. His eyes brightened, and he reached for the rosary with a reverence that made it clear this object held profound significance for him. "Thank you," he said, his fingers automatically moving to the beads as if drawn there by long habit. "Our Lady is very important to me. The rosary helps me stay close to her and to Jesus. I try to pray it every day, sometimes multiple times. I was praying it when I first started feeling sick, and I've been praying it constantly since coming to the hospital. Every day, sometimes multiple times. This 15-year-old boy, who should have been thinking about school and friends and sports and girls, prayed the rosary every day, multiple times. I thought of myself at 15 obsessed with my appearance, concerned about popularity and grades, interested in boys and fashion and music. Faith, prayer, spiritual devotion had been the furthest things from my mind. I'd wrote prayers before meals because my grandmother insisted. Had gone to Mass on Sundays because it was expected, but I'd never prayed because I wanted to, because it meant something to me personally. And here was this boy, facing death, clinging not to video games or comic books or sports equipment, but to a string of wooden beads. And a conviction that the Mother of God was somehow intimately involved in his life. Over the next, today's Tuesday and Wednesday, I witnessed something truly extraordinary in room 347. Something that challenged every assumption I'd built up over years of working with critically ill patients. Carlo wasn't just passively accepting his illness or going through the motions of being a good patient. He was actively, intentionally engaging with his condition on a spiritual level I'd never encountered before in anyone, let alone a teenage boy facing death. Tuesday was a difficult day, medically. Carlo's blood work came back showing continued deterioration. His blast cell count was rising. His clotting factors were dangerously imbalanced, and he was requiring frequent blood and platelet transfusions. The doctors were preparing to start aggressive chemotherapy, though his weakened condition made the treatment itself risky. There were hushed conversations outside his room about complications, about risks, about the narrow line they'd have to walk between treating the leukemia aggressively enough to make a difference and not overwhelming his already compromised system. But inside room 347, you'd never know how precarious the medical situation was based on Carlo's demeanor. Between the medical procedures, the blood draws that came every few hours, the examinations by rotating doctors and specialists, the adjustment of medications and transfusions, he prayed, constantly and consistently, with a focus that was almost otherworldly. I'd come in to check his vitals at midnight, and his fingers would be moving through those rosary beads, his lips moving silently as he cycled through the Hail Marys and Our Fathers. I'd return at 2 a.m. to adjust his full rate, and he'd still be praying, though his eyes were heavy with exhaustion and his body weak from disease. His mother would pray with him sometimes, their voices low and rhythmic in the quiet hours of the night. A litany of faith in a room filled with machines and medical equipment. But often he prayed alone, completely absorbed in his devotions, as if the hospital room had faded away and he was somewhere else entirely, some interior chapel of the soul where pain and fear couldn't reach. I'd seen patients try to distract themselves from their conditions with television or music or books. I'd seen them sleep as much as possible to escape their reality. I'd seen them rage against their fate or withdraw into depression. But I'd never seen anyone face serious illness with this kind of active, engaged spiritual practice. What struck me most profoundly was Carlo's concern for others, which never wavered despite his own suffering. When I'd come in to administer medications or adjust his IVS procedures that were often uncomfortable or even painful given his compromised veins and low platelet count that made him bruise so easily, he'd ask me about my day, about whether I was tired, about whether the shift was busy and if I was managing okay. He thanked every doctor who examined him, every nurse who brought medications, every technician who came to draw blood or deliver transfusions. He never complained, even when I could see he was in pain or deeply uncomfortable. On Tuesday morning, I overheard him talking with his mother about a website he'd been creating before he got sick, something about documenting Eucharistic miracles from around the world. Despite being in the hospital, despite facing a life-threatening illness, he was concerned about whether someone would be able to finish the project if he couldn't. Not if I die. He didn't use those words, but if I can't, with a peaceful acceptance of whatever God's will might be. He talked about the importance of the Eucharist, about how people didn't realize the miracle that happened at every Mass when bread and wine became the actual body and blood of Christ. His passion for this subject was evident even through his physical weakness, his voice gaining strength when he talked about Jesus truly present in the Eucharist. I found myself lingering in his room longer than necessary, making excuses to check equipment that didn't need checking or to verify vitals I just recorded. There was something magnetic about this boy, something that drew you in despite every professional instinct to maintain emotional distance. Part of it was the sheer unusualness of his response to his situation, the piece, where there should have been panic, the concern for others where there should have been self-absorption, the spiritual engagement where there should have been despair or denial. But it was more than that. There was a presence in room 347 that I couldn't quite explain or quantify. It wasn't anything visible or measurable by medical instruments. It was a quality of atmosphere, an almost tangible sense of peace that seemed to radiate from Carlo himself. Other patients' rooms felt heavy with fear and suffering, thick with the weight of illness and mortality. But room 347 felt different, lighter somehow, despite the gravity of the medical situation. On Tuesday afternoon, October 10th, something significant happened that would take on even greater meaning in light of what I would witness later that night. Carlo asked for a priest. He wanted to receive the anointing of the sick, the sacrament that used to be called last rites before the church changed the name to something less, explicitly connected to death, though everyone knew what it meant when a patient requested it. It was an acknowledgement of how serious the situation was, a spiritual preparation for the possibility of death. His parents arranged it immediately, though I could see the request had shaken them profoundly. Antonia's composed facade cracked for a moment when Carlo made the request. I saw her eyes fill with tears that she quickly blinked away, saw her hand tighten on his with a desperation that spoke of a mother trying to hold on to her child even as she felt him slipping away. Andrea turned back to the window, his shoulders shaking slightly in a way that suggested he was crying but didn't want Carlo to see. But Carlo himself was calm, even matter-of-fact about it. "I want to be ready," he told his parents simply. "I want to receive Jesus in the Eucharist and the sacrament of healing. Whatever happens, I want to be spiritually prepared. I'm not afraid, but I want to be ready." The priest arrived around 4 in the afternoon, an older man in his 60s, Father Giuseppe, who served as one of the hospital chaplains. I'd seen him countless times, making his rounds through the oncology ward, bringing communion to patients, sitting with families in waiting rooms, administering final sacraments to the dying. He had the kind of weathered kindness that comes from decades of ministering to people in their darkest hours. I wasn't in the room during the actual sacrament. It felt too private, too sacred for an outside observer, even a medical professional, but I saw Father Giuseppe arrive carrying a small case that contained the holy oils and hosts for communion. The door to room 347 closed, and for about an hour, that room became a chapel, a sacred space within the medical facility. I went about my other duties, checking on other patients, but I found my attention repeatedly drawn back to that closed door. I could hear the low murmur of prayers, though I couldn't make out the specific words. At one point, I heard singing a hymn I vaguely recognized from my childhood church attendance, probably Ave Maria based on the melody. The voices were Antonia's and the priest's primarily, with Carlo's weaker voice joining in occasionally. When Father Giuseppe finally emerged about an hour later, there was something profound in his expression, a mixture of sadness at Carlo's condition and something else. Something almost like He nodded to me as he passed, carrying his case of sacramental items, but he seemed deeply moved by whatever had transpired in that room. When I went in afterward to check on Carlo, around 5:30 in the evening, there was such a profound peace in that room that it almost took my breath away. The atmosphere had shifted somehow, become even more luminous in an intangible way. Carlo looked almost radiant. Despite his obvious physical deterioration, his skin was even paler, his bruises more pronounced, his breathing slightly labored, but his face held an expression of such complete serenity that it transformed his appearance. "How are you feeling?" I asked, checking the monitors that beeped steadily beside his bed, recording his struggling vital signs. "Blessed," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with conviction. "I received Jesus in the Eucharist. I received the anointing. That's all I need. Whatever happens now, I have everything I need. I didn't know what to say to that." In my experience, most people facing death wanted medical miracles, wanted promising test results, wanted reassurance that the treatments would work and they'd be fine. They wanted hope in the form of survival statistics and treatment plans. But Carlo seemed genuinely content, as if receiving the sacraments had given him something more valuable than any medical intervention we could offer, as if spiritual preparation was more important than physical healing. The priest was very kind. Carlo continued, his fingers finding his rosary beads again, beginning that now familiar pattern of prayer. He told me about other young people he's known who face serious illnesses with faith. He said, "I'm not alone, that the saints and Our Lady are praying for me, that Jesus himself understands suffering because he experienced it." I made notes in his chart, trying to maintain my professional detachment, but I was deeply affected by Carlo's state of mind. He was 15 years old, facing a potentially terminal illness, and he was at peace. Not in denial, not drawings, nothing down originally, inexplicably at peace. It defied everything I understood about how human beings respond to mortality threats. That evening Tuesday night, transitioning into the early hours of Wednesday morning, October 11th was when everything changed. When my understanding of reality, carefully constructed over 3 decades of life and nearly a decade of medical training and practice, was fundamentally shaken in a way I'm still processing years later. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning that strange, liminal hour when hospitals become even more surreal than usual. The daytime bustle has completely faded, leaving only the essential night staff moving through dimly lit corridors. Most patients are sleeping, aided by medication or simply exhausted by illness. The only sounds are the soft, rhythmic beeping of monitors, the occasional shuffle of footsteps, the distant ding of an elevator, the muted conversations at the nurse's station. Time feels different in hospitals at 2 amps slower, thicker, as if the normal rules of temporal flow don't quite apply. I was making my rounds, moving from room to room with practiced efficiency, checking on each patient, recording vital signs, adjusting medication drips and full rates, making sure everything was stable. Room 342 stable. Room 343 patient sleeping peacefully after pain medication. Room 344 restless but not in distress. Room 345 family members sleeping in the chair. Patient's oxygen saturation good. Room 346 IV pump needed adjusting. Quickly fixed. And then room 347. When I approached Carlo's room, I immediately noticed something unusual. There was light visible under the door, which wasn't particularly remarkable. In itself, many patients kept their lights on, uncomfortable with the darkness of hospital rooms, especially when dealing with fear and pain and the strangeness of being in an unfamiliar place. But as I got closer, I noticed something odd about the quality of the light seeping from beneath the door. It wasn't the harsh, fluorescent white of hospital overhead lights, which have a particular cold, clinical quality. It wasn't the warm yellow of the bedside reading lamps we provided. It was softer, gentler, with a quality that reminded me of candlelight, but that was impossible because open flames weren't permitted in patient rooms. The light seemed to flicker slightly, to pulse, but not in the erratic way of a malfunctioning bulb. It was rhythmic, almost organic, like breathing or a heartbeat. I paused outside the door, my hand on the handle, suddenly uncertain. Something felt different. The hair on my arm stood up slightly, and I experienced an odd sensation in my chest, not quite anxiety, not quite anticipation, but something in between. A feeling that I was about to step into something significant, though I had no rational reason to think that. I opened the door as quietly as possible, not wanting to disturb Carlo if he was sleeping, though the presence of light suggested he was awake. The door swung inward, and what I saw in that moment will be etched in my memory until the day I die. Carlo was lying in his hospital bed, his body positioned on his back, his head slightly elevated on pillows. His eyes were half open, in that state between waking and sleeping, between this world and some other realm. His hands were clasped loosely on his chest, fingers interlaced, and between his palms. Resting against the thin hospital gown was his rosary, and the rosary was glowing. I need to be extraordinarily precise about what I saw, because I've replayed this moment in my mind thousands of times over the years that have passed since that night. I've questioned myself, looking for rational explanations, wondering if exhaustion or stress or wishful thinking had created an illusion. But I know, with absolute certainty, what I witnessed. This wasn't a trick of light, wasn't a reflection, wasn't a hallucination. It was real. It was physical. And it was impossible by every scientific principle I'd ever learned. The rosary beads each individual bead. All 59 of them, if you counted the full strand, were emanating light from within. Not reflecting light from some external source, but producing their own luminescence, as if each wooden bead contained a tiny sun. The light was warm in color, a soft golden white that reminded me of early morning sunlight filtering through thin curtains, or the glow of honey held up to light, or the particular quality of illumination in Renaissance paintings of religious subjects where artists tried to depict divine radiance. It wasn't uniform brightness. The intensity varied slightly from bead to bead, creating a subtle pattern of brighter and slightly softer glows that rippled through the strand. The wooden beads themselves appeared unchanged in shape and size, but they were suffused with this radiance that seemed to come from their core, from within the very substance of the wood, as if the molecular structure itself had been temporarily transformed into something capable of emitting light. The crucifix at the end of the rosary shone even more brightly than the beads, with a silver-white luminescence that was almost painful to look at directly. The small corpus of Christ attached to the cross seemed to gleam with an inner fire, and I could see details I'd never noticed before: the texture of the metal, the careful rendering of Christ's suffering form, the inscription above his head. Despite the brightness, it wasn't harsh or glaring. It was gentle, inviting, warm, the kind of light you wanted to move toward rather than away from. I stood absolutely frozen in the doorway, my clipboard dangling forgotten from one hand, my mouth slightly open in shock. My medical training! All those years of education and experience that had taught me to approach every situation with clinical analysis and rational problem solving completely abandoned me. Every physiological principle I'd ever learned, every law of physics and chemistry and biology, screamed that what I was seeing was impossible. Matter doesn't spontaneously emit light without an energy source. Wooden beads don't glow. Objects don't illuminate themselves without heat, without chemical reactions, without some explicable cause. And yet, there it was, right in front of me, bathing the dim hospital room in gentle golden radiance. My first instinct, after the initial paralysis of shock wore off, was to look for a rational explanation. My eyes darted around the room, searching frantically for some source I was missing. Was there some kind of phosphorescent paint on the beads? But phosphorescence works through the absorption and slow release of light. It produces a greenish glow that fades relatively quickly. Not this steady, warm, golden white radiance that showed no signs of dimming. Was there a hidden light source I wasn't seeing? But the overhead lights were off, the bedside lamp was off, and the only other illumination in the room came from the monitors beside the bed, which produced a cold, bluish glow from their digital displays. Nothing remotely like this warm golden light. Could it be some kind of leaded device? But LEDs require batteries or external power, and even the best modern LEDs produced a slightly artificial quality of light. This was organic, natural, alive in a way that artificial light never is. And besides, I'd seen Carlo's rosary multiple times over the past 2 days. Handled it when it fell from his bed. noted it in my observations of his personal items. It was old, worn, clearly not a modern novelty item with hidden electronics. I stepped further into the room, my heart pounding so hard he could feel my pulse in me throat, fingertips, behind my eyes. My hands were shaking, and I realized I was experiencing a physiological stress response, elevated heart rate, rapid shallow breathing, adrenaline flooding my system. Fight or flight. My body was telling me, even though there was no threat, no danger, just this impossible, beautiful, terrifying phenomenon. Carlo's eyes moved slowly to meet mine. There was no surprise in his gaze, no shock or fear. Just that same profound peace I'd noticed from the first moment I met him, now deepened even further. He looked at me with a gentleness and understanding that seemed far beyond his 15 years. As if he'd been expecting this. As if this was a natural part of his experience rather than a reality-shattering miracle. "Carlo," I whispered, my voice shaking so badly I could barely form words. My throat felt tight, constricted, as if my body was rebelling against having to articulate what I was witnessing. "Your rosary. I don't understand. Double quotes, I know," he said softly, his own voice weak but utterly calm. "She's here. She." I managed to ask, though part of me already knew what he meant. My legs felt unsteady, and I gripped the edge of his bed for support, my knuckles white with the force of my grip. "Our Lady," Carlo said simply, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "The Blessed Virgin Mary. She's always here, always close to us, but sometimes we can see signs of her presence more clearly. Sometimes God allows us to perceive what's always true, that we're surrounded by heaven, that the spiritual realm is as real as the physical one, that we're never truly alone." I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the room, to call someone, to report this medically impossible phenomenon, to get witnesses, to document this systematically. But I found myself rooted to the spot, transfixed by the light emanating from those beads, unable to move. It was as if the light itself exerted some kind of gravitational pull, drawing me, holding me there. "How long has it been like this?" I asked, my professional training finally asserting itself enough to form a coherent question. I glanced at the monitors beside the bed, half expecting them to be showing some kind of anomalous readings, some physiological explanation for what I was seeing. But everything appeared completely normal. Carlo's heart rate was steady at 105 beats per minute, slightly elevated but appropriate for his condition. His oxygen saturation was holding at 92%, acceptable given his anemia. His blood pressure was 95/65, low but stable. Nothing about his vital signs suggested anything unusual was happening. "It started when I was praying," Carlo explained, his voice slightly hoarse but steady. "Maybe about 20 minutes ago, perhaps a bit longer. I couldn't sleep. I was feeling anxious about everything, about being sick, about my parents worrying, about whether I'd done enough with my life if this is the end. So I started praying the rosary, asking Our Lady to help me accept God's will, whatever that might be, to help me trust more completely, to surrender my fear and anxiety." He paused, taking a slow, careful breath that I could see required effort given his compromised lung function. "And then, as I was praying, I felt this warmth start in my hands. At first I thought maybe it was just circulation improving or something physical. But then the warmth grew stronger, and it felt different from regular heat. It felt like being wrapped in love, if that makes any sense. Like being held by someone who cares about you completely. 20 minutes. This impossible phenomenon had been occurring for 20 minutes. And no one had noticed because the door was closed and it was the middle of the night, when the ward was at its quietest. 20 minutes of what should have been immediately visible evidence of something beyond nature occurring in this room. And then I opened my eyes. Carlo continued, his fingers still gently holding the glowing rosary, and I saw the light. The beads were glowing, just like they are now. And I understood that it was a gift, a sign, not For me, necessarily my faith doesn't need proof. But for others who might need to see that God is real, that heaven is real, that we're not alone even in our darkest moments, does it hurt? I asked, falling back on medical assessment because it was the only framework I had to understand what was happening. The only way my mind could process this. Do you feel any pain? Any burning? Any unusual sensations? No pain. Carlo assured me, his voice gentle as if he understood how disoriented I was. Just peace. Just warmth. Just an overwhelming sense of being loved completely. It's like when you're a small child and your mother holds you when you're scared, and you feel absolutely safe. It's like that, but infinitely more intense. It's the presence of divine love, made somehow tangible, somehow perceivable even to our limited human senses. I forced myself to move closer to the bed, my professional duty overriding my instinct to flee from something that defied all natural explanation. I needed to assess his condition properly, to make sure he wasn't having some kind of medical crisis that was causing hallucinations or neurological symptoms. I'd heard of temporal lobe seizures that could cause religious visions, of hypoxia that could trigger hallucinations. But those affected the patient's perception. They didn't cause physical objects to emit real, measurable light that anyone could see. Eh? I asked, gesturing toward his hands, intending to take his pulse manually even though the monitor was already tracking it. I needed to touch him, to ground myself in something physical and measurable. Carlo nodded and relaxed his hands slightly, though he didn't release the rosary. His fingers remained curled around the beads, maintaining contact but allowing me access. I placed my fingers on his wrist, feeling for his radial pulse in the traditional way. And as I did, my hand came within inches of the glowing beads. What I experienced in that moment was beyond anything I can adequately describe with the limited vocabulary we have for physical sensations. The warmth I felt radiating from the rosary was completely unlike any heat I'd ever encountered. It wasn't the burning heat of fire, which damages and destroys. It wasn't the sharp heat of fever, which signals illness and infection. It wasn't even the pleasant warmth of summer sunshine or a hot bath. This was something fundamentally different, a warmth that seemed to penetrate beyond the physical, beyond skin and muscle and bone, reaching something deeper. It felt like it was warming my soul. If such a thing exists, touching something essential and immaterial inside me that I hadn't even known was cold until it began to warm. And with the warmth came an overwhelming emotional experience that I still struggled to articulate years later. In that brief moment of proximity to the glowing rosary, I felt completely and utterly loved. Not romantic love, not familial affection, not friendship, but something vaster and more foundational. I felt known, truly known. Every flaw and failure and secret shame and simultaneously accepted, valued, cherished. I felt a peace so profound it seemed to dissolve all the anxiety and fear and stress I'd been carrying for years. All the armor I'd built up to survive working in oncology, all the grief I'd never processed from patients I'd lost. For just that brief, overwhelming moment, I felt like I was home, though I'd never been in this place before. I felt safe in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. I felt that everything would be okay, even though rationally I knew Carlo was dying, knew that suffering was real, knew that the world was full of pain and injustice. But underneath all of that, at some fundamental level, I experienced an absolute conviction that love was the deepest truth of reality, that we were held by something infinitely good, that the darkness wasn't the final word. Tears began streaming down my face before I even realized I was crying. They weren't tears of sadness, though there was sadness present. They weren't tears of joy, though joy was there too. They were tears of recognition, maybe, of seeing something true that I'd been denying for years, of having my carefully constructed worldview crack open to reveal a reality far more complex and beautiful than I'd allowed myself to believe. I pulled my hand back, trembling violently, and had to grip the bed rail to keep from collapsing. My legs felt weak, my entire body shaking with the force of what I'd just experienced. My medical training was screaming that this was impossible, that I was tired and stressed and seeing things, that there had to be a rational explanation. But the evidence was right in front of me, bathing the dim hospital room in gentle golden light, radiating a warmth that I could still feel even with my hand withdrawn, producing an effect on my consciousness that couldn't be explained by any neurological or psychological framework I knew. "Alessandra," Carlo said, and the way he said my name with such kindness and understanding made me look into his eyes. Despite his physical weakness, despite the pallor of serious illness, his eyes were luminous, filled with that same quality of peace and love that the rosary was radiating. "Don't be afraid. I know this is shocking. I know it challenges everything you think you understand about how the world works. But this is a gift, not a threat. It's a sign meant to strengthen faith, to remind us that the material world isn't all there is, that God is real and present and loving even in the midst of suffering. I should get the doctor," I said, my voice barely functioning, coming out as little more than a hoarse whisper. My professional instincts, which had been completely overwhelmed, were starting to reassert themselves. I should document this, call someone, get witnesses. This is impossible. This shouldn't be happening. Medical science doesn't have any explanation for this. If you need to," Carlo said peacefully, his tone suggesting he understood my confusion and wasn't offended by my response. "But I don't think it will last much longer. In my experience with these things, and I've read about many miraculous events in my research on Eucharistic miracles, they're temporary. They're meant to strengthen faith and provide signs, not to prove God's existence conclusively. They appear when needed and then fade, leaving only the memory and the impact on those who witnessed them." Even as he spoke, I could see he was right. The light wasn't as bright as it had been when I first entered the room. The glow was beginning to fade, not suddenly or dramatically, but gradually, like the sun setting in slow motion. The golden white radiance was dimming, becoming softer, less intense. The warmth that filled the room, that impossible, penetrating warmth that had nothing to do with the heating system, was slowly dissipating, returning to the normal ambient temperature of a hospital room in October. I watched, transfixed, as the light continued to fade over the next 2 or 3 minutes. The beads went from brilliantly luminous to merely bright, from bright to softly glowing, from softly glowing to just faintly visible, and finally to completely ordinary. Within a few minutes of my arrival in the room, the rosary looked completely normal, just well-worn wooden beads and a simple metal crucifix, catching only the faint, reflected light from the monitors beside the bed. But I had seen it. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't explain it away or pretend it had been a trick of exhausted eyes or an overactive imagination influenced by Carlo's obvious faith. The physical light was gone, but the impact remained, carved into my consciousness like a brand, impossible to ignore or forget. The residual warmth lingered in my hands for several minutes after the light had completely faded, as if my skin had absorbed some quality that couldn't immediately dissipate. My heart was still racing, my breathing still uneven. I felt fundamentally altered, as if something in my basic understanding of reality had shifted at a cellular level. "Are you okay?" Carlo asked me, his concern shifting from himself to me even now, even in the middle of his own crisis. His voice was weak, speaking seemed to exhaust him, but his care was genuine. I realized I was still crying, tears running down my cheeks and dripping onto my scrubs. I wiped them away quickly with the back of my hand, embarrassed by this unprofessional, emotional display. In 8 years of working in oncology, I'd prided myself on maintaining composure, on never breaking down in front of patients. And here I was, sobbing in front of a 15-year-old boy who had infinitely more reason to cry than I did. "I'm fine," I managed to say, though I was clearly anything but fine. My entire worldview had just been shaken to its foundations, and I was supposed to go back to checking vital signs and adjusting for drips as if nothing extraordinary had happened. I've never seen anything like that. Never even imagined anything like that was possible. Most people haven't, Carlo said gently. And that's okay. We're not meant to live by constant miracles and supernatural signs. Faith usually means believing without seeing, trusting without proof. But sometimes, rarely, God gives us a glimpse behind the veil, a moment where the spiritual realm becomes briefly visible to our physical senses. Not to make faith easy, but to strengthen us for what's ahead. To remind us that our limited perception isn't the full reality. I checked his vitals again. More to give myself something concrete to do than because I thought anything had changed medically. I needed to engage with the familiar routines of my work, to ground myself in the practical and measurable. Everything was the same as it had been an hour earlier. His pulse was still elevated but steady. His blood pressure was still low but stable. His oxygen saturation was holding. No miraculous physical improvement in his blood counts. No sudden remission. No healing of his diseased bone marrow. Whatever had happened with the rosary, it wasn't a physical healing in the medical sense. The leukemia was still progressing. His body was still failing. He was still dying. What does it mean? I asked, surprising myself with the question. I wasn't sure I believed in meanings in that sense. Carlo was quiet for a moment, his fingers still moving over the now normal rosary beads. I think it means that I'm not alone, he said finally. Even in death, God is wills. It's with us, and that's enough. That's more than enough. I stayed with him for a while longer, ostensibly monitoring his condition, but really just trying to process what I'd witnessed. We talked, or rather, Carlo talked and I listened. He told me about his devotion to the Eucharist, about how he'd been creating a website documenting Eucharistic miracles around the world. He talked about his love for Our Lady, about how he tried to pray the rosary every day because it brought him closer to Jesus through his mother's intercession. He spoke with such conviction, such genuine faith, that I found myself envying him. Here was a boy facing death, with more peace than most people I knew faced an ordinary day. And I had just witnessed something that defied every scientific principle I'd ever learned. Something that suggested there might be more to reality than blood and bones and chemical reactions. Do you believe in miracles? Carlo asked me at one point. I hesitated. Hours earlier, I would have said no, or at least been deeply skeptical. But now? I don't know what I believe. I admitted. I just saw something I can't explain. That's a start, Carlo said with a gentle smile. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when you don't understand. The rest of that night shift passed in a blur. I went through my rounds mechanically, checking on other patients. But my mind kept returning to room 347, to the impossible light I'd seen, to the warmth I'd felt. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? Who would believe me? I barely believed myself, except that I knew with absolute certainty what I had witnessed. When my shift ended at 7 in the morning, I was exhausted but wired to sleep. I went home to my small apartment, made coffee I didn't drink, and sat staring out the window as the October sun rose over Monza. Everything looked the same as it had yesterday, the same buildings, the same streets, the same ordinary world. But I felt fundamentally changed, as if something in me had shifted at a cellular level. I worked the next night shift, Wednesday evening into Thursday morning. When I arrived at the hospital, I learned that Carlo had slipped into a coma earlier that day. There had been a cerebral hemorrhage, a devastating complication of his leukemia. He'd been declared brain dead at 5 in the afternoon. My heart sank when I heard the news. I went to room 347, knowing what I would find but needing to see it anyway. Carlo was there, his body maintained on life support, the machines breathing for him, monitoring his failing systems. His parents were there, devastated but maintaining a dignified composure even in their grief. His father held his hand. His mother prayed quietly. And there, still clasped in Carlo's motionless hands, was the rosary. It looked ordinary now, just wooden beads and metal. No mysterious light. no supernatural warmth. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what had happened in this room just 36 hours earlier. Carlo died the next morning, Thursday, October 12th, at 6:45 a.m. I wasn't there when it happened. I was on a different shift. But I heard about it, and something in me broke. This boy who had shown such faith, such peace, such love for God and for others, was gone. 15 years old, his whole life ahead of him, snuffed out by a cruel disease that had taken him from healthy teenager to corpse in less than 2 weeks. In the days after Carlo's death, I found myself questioning everything. If God loved him so much, if Our Lady was so present to him, why hadn't they saved him? Why show me that impossible sign with the rosary if it was all going to end in death anyway? What was the point? I was angry at God, if he existed, angry at the universe for its fundamental unfairness, angry at myself for having been moved by something that now seemed like a cruel joke. But I couldn't shake the memory of Carlo's face in those final conscious hours, the absolute peace in his eyes. I'm in God's hands, he had said, and he'd meant it. He hadn't been asking for a cure. He'd been accepting whatever came, trusting in a plan beyond his understanding. And then I remembered what he'd said about the glowing rosary. These things are meant to strengthen faith, not to prove it. The miracle because I had finally accepted that it was a miracle, that there was no other explanation hadn't been about healing his body. It had been about something else entirely. A sign. Yes, but not of the type I'd initially assumed. Not a promise that everything would be fine in the earthly sense. It was a sign of presence, of love that transcends physical death, of a reality beyond what my medical training and scientific worldview could encompass. I started researching Carlo after his death. I learned about his dedication to the Eucharist, his cataloging of Eucharistic miracles, his devotion to Our Lady. I discovered that the family had donated his organs even in death Carlo had found to help others. I read about the hundreds of people who attended his funeral, who had been touched by his brief life. And slowly, very slowly, I began to understand what I had witnessed that night in room 347, the glowing rosary. Hadn't been about Carlo. He hadn't needed that sign. His faith was already complete. It had been for me, for the skeptical nursing technician who had let her grandmother's faith slip away, who had reduced existence to physiological processes and chemical reactions, who needed to see something impossible to begin believing in the possible. I went back to church that Christmas. It felt strange at first, uncomfortable like putting on clothes that no longer fit quite right. But I kept going. I started praying again, hesitantly at first, not even sure who I was talking to or if anyone was listening. I bought a rosary, not an expensive one, just simple wooden beads. Similar to Carlo's aunt, I learned the prayers I'd forgotten, the mysteries I'd never really understood as a child. I didn't have a dramatic conversion. There was no lightning bolt, no angelic visitation, no sudden certainty, just a slow, gradual opening of something that had been closed in me for a very long time. A willingness to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was more to existence than what I could see and measure and test. Years passed. I continued working at San Gerardo, continued caring for patients, many of whom died despite our best efforts. But I carried the memory of those 3 October days with me, a secret knowledge that gave me comfort when the medical realities seemed too harsh to bear. In 2013, I heard that the process for Carlo's beatification had begun. 7 years after his death, the church was investigating whether he should be declared a saint. I wasn't surprised. Anyone who had known him, who had witnessed his extraordinary faith and love, would have seen his holiness. I never officially reported what I saw that night. It felt too private, too sacred to reduce to a medical incident report or an official statement for a beatification investigation. What could I say? At approximately 2 a.m. on October 11th, 2006, patients' rosary beads exhibited unexplained luminescence. The words would cheapen what had happened. make it seem clinical and cold when it had been anything but. But I told my story to others over the years, to my family, to friends who asked about my renewed faith, to other healthcare workers who struggled with seeing so much suffering and death. Some believed me. Some thought I'd been exhausted and had experienced a hallucination. Some politely changed the subject. It didn't matter. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and no amount of skepticism from others could take that away from me. In 2020, when Carlo was beatified, I watched the ceremony on television from my living room. Pope Francis officially declared him Blessed Carlo Acutis, and I cried not just tears of sadness for the beautiful boy who had died so young, but tears of joy that his sanctity was being recognized, that his example would inspire others. I thought about that glowing rosary often. I thought about the warmth that had radiated from those beads, the overwhelming sense of love and peace I had felt. I thought about Carlo's words, "She's here. Our Lady is always here." But sometimes we can see signs of her presence more clearly. The older I get, the more I understand that faith isn't about certainty. It's about trust in the face of uncertainty, hope in the face of suffering, love in the face of death. Carlo had understood this at 15 years old, with a wisdom that exceeded his years. I was still learning it in my 40s, still struggling with doubts and questions, still sometimes wondering if I'd imagined that whole impossible night. But then I would remember the light, the warmth, the peace, and I would know, with a certainty deeper than any medical diagnosis or scientific proof, that I had witnessed something real, something miraculous, something that pointed beyond the physical world to a reality of grace and love that sustained us all, whether we knew it or not. I'm in my 50s now, still working as a nursing technician, though I've moved to a different hospital. I still care for patients with terminal illnesses, still witness suffering and death on a regular basis, but I see it differently now. I see it through the lens of Carlo's faith, through the understanding that death is not the end, that our physical bodies are not all we are. I pray the rosary every day, now, my fingers, moving over the worn wooden beads just as Carlo's did, just as my grandmother's did before me. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I think I can feel a warmth in those beads that goes beyond their physical temperature. I don't think they'll ever glow like Carlo's did. That was a unique grace, a one-time gift meant for a specific moment. But the spiritual reality they represent is always there, always available, always radiating divine love, even when we can't see it. Carlo's canonization is scheduled for 2025. When it happens, when he's officially declared Saint Carlo Acutis, I'll be there if I can. I'll stand in St. Peter's Square and think about the 3 days I spent caring for him, about the brief conversations we had, about his remarkable faith and peace in the face of death. And I'll think about the rosary, the impossible, inexplicable, beautiful miracle of those glowing beads, that tangible sign of heaven's presence in a dark hospital room at 2 a.m. A sign not of physical healing, but of something far more important. The promise that we are never alone, never abandoned, never beyond the reach of God's love. That's what Carlo's life meant. That's what his death meant. That's what the miracle of the rosary meant. Not that we'll be spared suffering or death. Those are inevitable parts of human existence. But that suffering and death are not the final words. Love is the final word. Grace is the final word. God is the final word. I carry that knowledge with me every day into every hospital room, with every patient I care for. Some of them will recover, some won't. Some have faith, some don't. Some face death with peace, some with fear. But all of them, whether they know it or not, are held in the same loving hands that held Carlo. The same divine embrace that made his rosary glow with impossible light on an October night in 2006. I don't call myself a saint. I'm not particularly holy. Still struggle with doubt and fear and all the ordinary weaknesses of human nature. But I'm trying. I'm praying. I'm trusting, even when I don't understand. Because a 15-year-old boy with a glowing rosary taught me that faith isn't. about having all the answers or experiencing constant miracles. It's about taking one small step after another, one prayer at a time, one rosary decade at a time, walking toward a light we can't always see but that we know is there, waiting for us at the end of all things. That light is real. I've seen it with my own eyes, felt it with my own hands, and nothing not death, not suffering, not doubt, not the passage of time can ever take that certainty away from me. If this story has touched your heart and awakened your faith, pray to Blessed Carlo Acutis and ask for his intercession. Subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and turn on the notification bell for more stories that bring light to our spiritual journey.